And there's an analogy that helps me to understand this. It goes this way, that each saint is a small piece of a stained glass window, and that Christ is a light that shines through, bringing beauty to the world. Each one of us here is called to be one little piece in that stained glass window. During the time that the great John Paul II was Pope, the trend was to think of saints as a bit irrelevant, as it is now. And I think there were people who kind of told him when he came in, all right, enough with the canonisations, we're not going to be having much of that while you're around. But that great Pope had the profound realisation that we need the friendship prayer and example of the saints now more than ever. So, accordingly, during the first 20 years of his pontificate, 805 men and women were declared blessed and 205 were declared saints. Thank you, JP2. I want to now share with you about the last saint to be canonised by JP2 the Great. Because perhaps you're still convinced that ordinary people aren't meant to be saints. So I'll tell you about Giovanna Beretta, who was born in Milan in 1922 and raised in a family that was marked by unselfish love and a deep trust in the Lord's providence, but a pretty average Italian family at the time. She was an active, happy, musical child. She received her religious education from her family in a school. And then she went to medical school, which is why I love her so much. In 1949, she finished medical school, and 3 years later, she qualified as a paediatrician. And she regarded her profession not just as a job, but as a mission through which she could aid and nurture both bodies and souls. The thing about Giovanna is that her life as a single woman centred around her medicine and her involvement with St Vincent de Paul and other Catholic societies, but was also punctuated by trips to the mountains to go rock climbing and skiing, to play tennis, to go dancing, which she loved. She simply loved life. And this seems to be the distinguishing feature of all she did, this undescribable joy. Whether she was visiting the elderly, treating the sick, skiing the Alps or praying a rosary, all was done with joy. She did once consider entering a religious order, but with the aid of spiritual direction discerned that this was not her calling. And what she said about vocation was that we should enter onto the path that God wills for us, not by forcing the door, but when God wills and as God wills. And indeed, with her pure heart, she did have to wait patiently, because it was not until she was 32 that she met the love of her life, Pietro Molla, an engineer. The two fell very quickly in love. They had 1 year of courtship and they wrote love letters during this time, and we're very fortunate to still have them with us. And they're a great favourite. The book is a great favourite amongst me, my friends, boys and girls alike. What it reveals is that in her married life, she grew deeper in her understanding of the meaning of dedication and self-giving love. When you read their love letters, you realise theirs is surely a marriage made in heaven. Another remarkable feature is that she continued her medical practice during her marriage and motherhood as long as her obligations as wife and mother allowed it. And this was a decision that Pietro and Gianna made together. And accordingly, she gave birth to a son and 2 daughters, and after some sad miscarriages in 1961 conceived her 4th child. Early on in the pregnancy, it was discovered that Gianna had a tumour in her uterine wall. A surgery was suggested to her that would probably take the life of the baby. And Pietro and Gianna rejected this idea straight away. Gianna always insisted that the baby be protected at all costs. And just before she gave birth, she realised, and I don't think Pietro realised, but she realised there would probably be complications. So she made Pietro promise again, if it is necessary to choose, please choose the baby and not mine, not my life. I want to be clear that under church teaching, she was actually not obliged to make this choice, but the fact that she made it anyway shows her heroic virtue. So what happened? In 1962, on Good Friday, and I don't think that's a coincidence that it was on Good Friday, Gianna entered the hospital, and the next day on Holy Saturday, Gianna Emanuela, her 4th child, was born very healthy. But Gianna developed complications, and after a week in agony with severe sepsis, she passed away at the age of 39. As she lay dying, she repeated, "Jesus, I love you," over and over again. I don't think we can have a clue what kind of Calvary she was living at that time. Not only bodily, but the thought of leaving her whole family behind. Almost immediately upon her death, a devotion to Gianna arose amongst those whose life she had so deeply touched, because they'd witnessed her heroic devotion to her faith and her family. Just as with St. Maximilian, St. Gianna's death is probably that for which she's become most well known. But it has since been realised that it wasn't just her death that marks her life. No. Her whole life was an uninterrupted act of Christian witness in a very ordinary life. She was a mother canonised precisely for the way in which she knew how to live every phase in that ordinary life. Firstly, as a single woman at the service of the church. Secondly, as a wife and mother. Gianna is a saint because she reminds us that life is beautiful, that God is happy when we climb a mountain to contemplate a snow-covered valley, that God is happy when we help our brother, and when we pray with our children. Interestingly, Gianna Emanuela, that fourth child, grew up to be a physician herself, and she now specialises in Alzheimer's disease. And she was present in 2004 when JP2 canonised her mother, the first time a child has been there at the canonisation of their parent. But I think a word needs to be said about Pietro, her husband that she left behind. Because I think it would be easy for us to think that Pietro was a bit hard done by. After all, he was suddenly left grieving after the love of his life, with 4 children under the age of 6 to raise. He does reflect that this was a difficult time, but he also insists that the example of his wife's serene and joyous faith helped sustain him through his grief at Gianna's death. And all his life, since 1962 for 48 years, he has been a pillar of faith, courage and devotion for his family. I think it's funny that when he was first informed that there was a cause for canonisation of his wife, he was surprised. He'd never heard of a mother becoming a saint. And at that time he said, "I did not realise that I lived with a saint." I think this tends to show what a saintly man he must have been in his own life. How could you live with a saint and not realise? It's true that Gianna was not present as the children were growing up, but each of them, and Pietro too, will testify that she interceded for them from heaven. Kind of a cool mother, right? So later in his life, Pietro wrote to Gianna that he wrote to her, "You demonstrated to me that we can totally fulfill the Lord's will and become saints without renouncing the fullness of the best pure joys that life and nature offer us." And Pietro has spent 48 years contemplating the lessons that his wife left him. And then, just 9 days ago, early on Holy Saturday morning, and remember it was on Holy Saturday that Gianna gave birth to Gianna, her first child, Pietro Molla, aged 97 years old, surrounded by his children, went to join his wife in heaven. And can't you just imagine it now? As Pietro is finally reunited with the woman who inspired him in this world and who interceded for him from the next. Now, it's my assertion, but I think that Pietro is probably a saint in heaven right now. Can't you just picture it, both of them together? What do they teach us? Both in their own way. Both Gianna and Pietro make holiness attainable for all of us. They teach us that we are all called to holiness, and that it is through our own vocation that we reach holiness. They each helped each other to become saints. That was their vocation in life. I think this is so crucial for us because a fair chunk of, we all have a vocation, and our vocation is meant to lead us to holiness. If we're called to marriage, the highest priority of our spouse should be our holiness, and likewise us for them. It's the same if we're called to religious life. That should be our route to holiness. And that's what Gianna and Pietro teach us.